Hello, this is Dr. James Camp at Lee College in Baytown, Texas, and today we're going to write your first C++ program. As you can see, I'm firing up a program called Visual Studio from Microsoft. Visual Studio is what we call an IDE, or integrated development environment. That means it combines or integrates a lot of tools into one software package. It lets you edit your code, compile your code, run your code, and even debug your code, step through it little bits at a time, check on it, all within one program. The traditional way of programming a long time ago, and you can still do this in some programming environments, like if you had a Linux box and you wanted to program with GCC, is you have one program that does your editing and another program that does your compiling, and then you just run your programs at the command line and see what happens. So the IDE approach is much more popular these days. Very common to find these. You do not have to use Visual Studio to program in C++ in my class. Visual Studio is probably the premier program for C++ programming on Windows. On Mac, you would want to use Xcode, Apple's coding program, Apple's IDE, or on either platform, or in Linux, you could use a third-party free software program like Eclipse. Is a very popular IDE. Okay, well, all IDEs are going to open up with some sort of a window like this that maybe shows you your history, your programming history. I have obviously written several other programs. This is not my first C++ program, not my first rodeo, as the saying goes. So if I wanted to open one of the programs that Visual Studio already knew about or remembered, I could click on one and it would open that program here with a list of all the files that are part of my project, and a list of and I could double click one and open the code file for it, and you'd see all sorts of code that you at present do not understand because you're just getting started with your life in C. So let's close out of this, start it up again, and what we're going to do is create a new project. Almost all IDEs in this landing page have a new project button, and they almost all offer you some sort of template. Okay, in Visual Studio, you can narrow down your templates by language, so we want to program in C++ today. For some reason, I've got web project types, so I could choose a console app to get started with. I'm going to choose an empty project because I want to show you all the components that go into C++ programming. Hello is going to be my project name. By default, it puts it in a folder called source/repos. A repo is a repository, and this is a thing that a lot of programmers use a service called GitHub that stores your code online in a safe environment, so you always have a backup of your code. And in fact, it also stores each incremental change to your code that you make, so that if you do something that introduces a major bug and you can't figure out where that came from, you can step back a day or two until and get the last version of the code that worked properly. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create my file. We're halfway through my 10-minute video and I haven't written any code yet. Okay, so I'm going to go to Hello. I'm going to go to Source Files. I'm going to add a new item. What I want is a C++ file. C++ files end in the extension .cpp. Okay. Oftentimes you give your main CPP file a name that matches the name of the program you're writing. Hello. Other people will call the main programs main.cpp. There's no real rhyme or reason to that as long as you remember what it's called. Okay. So the first thing that every C++ file needs is a main function. We'll call it, it always starts with the introductory keyword int. We'll explain what that means in a future video. Main, and then two parentheses, an open and a closed parentheses, that tells C++ this is a special bit of code called a function. And a function is a set of code that can be called from another function, another bit of code. So a function is a self-contained bit of code that runs when it's called. Well, the main function is always the first thing that's called when you start a C++ program. When the operating system tries to run my program hello, it's going to start by looking for the main function. We then put in a pair of curly brackets. Okay, this one is pronounced open curly and that one's pronounced close curly. These set off a code block, a bit of code that again kind of forms a complete unit, runs together. Okay, now we want to do something, and the most obvious thing we can do is say something to the user. Well, this C++ programs by default do not run in a graphical environment like most programs that you're used to. They run on what's called a console. So console console output equals cout. So I'm going to use the cout object, and I'm going to send some text to it. And the traditional first text that every programmer prints the first time they write a successful program is the text hello world. Now, the benefit of having an IDE is that the debugger is built in, the code analyzer is built in, all of these tools are built in. So Microsoft's IDE puts a little red squiggle under code that it thinks has an error in it. And the error is that cout is not defined. The reason cout is not defined is that I haven't imported the library that cout is contained in. C++ is what we call a modular language. Everything that you could possibly want to do with it is included in a library module. And in order to get that library module, you have to include it. So we use the pound include is how programmers would pronounce it. You might call it hashtag include in the Twitter era, but it's not pronounced that way. It's pronounced pound include. We pound include, and then we use angle brackets to indicate that we're talking about part of the standard library. IO stream. Okay, and again, this is input output stream is what that library means. A lot of the things in C++ were, date back to a time when console input was very expensive. Your console was literally a screen with a keyboard plugged into a telephone line that ran to a mainframe computer that might be several rooms down the hall. And so each time you typed a character, it got sent to the computer, and then it had to get sent, a signal had to get sent back to your console to indicate that, yes, in fact, the character you sent had been accepted. And so typing was very slow. If you made a mistake, fixing it was very slow. So instead of writing console output, they abbreviated it down to cout. Instead of writing input-output stream, they abbreviated it down to IOStream. So a lot of the keywords in C++ are artificially shortened because it used to be much harder to type them in. Nowadays, once the compiler, once the IDE figures out what it thinks you're trying to write, it will often offer to complete long keywords for you. The typing is so much easier today. Okay, so we've got one more problem here. cout is still not recognized. That's because we haven't told the computer that it comes from the standard library. STD does not mean sexually transmitted disease. It's an abbreviation for standard. Okay, again, we've shortened all of these words. So cout lives in the standard library namespace, or abbreviated standard. Okay, now if we know that we're going to be using the standard library namespace a lot in our program, which we very frequently do, we can add a keyword directive using namespace standard. And now I don't have to put standard : in front of cout. I can just use cout, and it will know to look it up in the standard library namespace. Okay, so we've written our first program here in C++. It's not a very impressive program, but it's got all the pieces. It's got a compiler directive that includes the IOStream library. It's got a using directive that tells the compiler we're using the standard namespace. It's got a main function that does something, and the something it does is to write hello world to console output. So let's see what happens when we run this. Okay. Want you to note that it did some compiling down here. If you run your video back a little bit, you'll see a couple of status messages that showed up in this output window. Let's see if I can get back to them. This is the debug. Let's see. Build. There we go. It built the hello.cpp file, compiled that file, and it interpreted some information in the Visual C project file to say that we wanted to build hello.exe, an executable program file. Then it ran hello.exe, okay, and we got this little output console here that said, in fact, hello world. We could make it look a little fancier if we want to. We could say cout HELLO, comma, space, WORLD, exclamation point, plus, okay. Okay, now if I run this, what do you expect that we would see? You would expect us to see a little box around hello world. That's not what we got. Why not? Well, the answer there is that this is not a syntax error. There are two kinds of errors you get when you run a program. A syntax error is like that little red underline that said something is wrong and it won't compile. Something is wrong with the language of the program, the syntax. A logic error is when you write all your syntax correctly, but you've told the program to do something different than what you actually wanted it to do. Your logic was wrong. In this case, what we forgot was to tell it to start a new line between each of these C outputs. Well, there's a convenient little keyword, ENDL, for end line. Again, one of these little really compact C++ notations that's endlessly frustrating to, it makes your code endlessly frustrating to read. Okay, so now if we run this, we get hello world with 3 end line characters in the places we want them, and it's a nice pretty little box. Okay, I'm going to leave you there, and we'll start our next with a 15-minute first program here, and we're going to we'll continue next time talking about variables.